Hey, Nell, thank you for coming in. You've got such a marvelous history of contribution to the world in so many different ways, and we really appreciate you coming in and sharing your insights with our audience.
My pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure to join you today, Stephen.
So now, what were those inflection points in your life? Maybe when you were very young, let's say a young person in two or three, maybe it was five, maybe it was in school, a mentorship, maybe it's some of the early jobs you had that created this wonderful career that you have and all the wonderful work that you do today.
In many ways, a lot of my interest in the domain of AI and later AI ethics and safety really stems from a diet of science fiction novels that my father, my engineer father, had instilled in me at an early age. I think he was particularly interested in the kind of golden age of science fiction in the 50s, 60s, and that era is quite optimistic, right? There's a vision of the future where we're going to go out into the cosmos and do amazing things, have all kinds of adventures, and muddle through various difficulties. And then later in the 70s and 80s, science fiction generally started to take a darker turn, right? It was all about vicious aliens and dystopias and things which were a disconcerting reflection of some of the emerging social issues of the time. But like my father, who'd grown up in the 50s and 60s, I read his diet of science fiction. And so a lot of my vision of the future was slightly rosier. I think I've had a strong interest in AI ethics and safety because of science fiction, because of reading Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke novels and Heinlein novels, etc., all about how human beings and machines can work together, and ideally work together in ways that are mutually beneficial, not just beneficial to one party. And I ended up in the realm of machine learning almost by accident, in the sense that I was trying to solve a very difficult problem, which is capturing the body, or capturing the human body, from two photographs. So one shot from the front, one shot from the side, which is a technique called stereophotogrammetry. And we had a difficult problem, which was cutting the person out of the background, right? Image segmentation, which today is considered rather trivial, but back around 2010 or so was not. And it actually required all kinds of handwritten custom algorithms, an immense amount of work to try to get this process functional. And it worked reasonably well some of the time, but it wasn't in any way robust. And that was an issue, of course, because you want to be measuring the person and not the flowery wallpaper behind them. So with our custom handmade algorithms, we could get the head to fit, but then the crotch would break, or we'd get the arms to fit and then the feet would break. That's when, around about the time when deep learning started to emerge, when around about 2013 or so, deep machine vision, convolutional neural networks started to come to the fore. We started to realize how much progress there was in that space and just how transformative that was ultimately going to be for the world. And so I was able to apply technologies like convolutional neural networks to this problem space of image segmentation, simply by feeding this machine learning system with hundreds of different examples of human beings manually hand cut in Photoshop between the image and the silhouette. And with that key of the image and the silhouette, we were able to get a very robust image segmentation mechanism, which made the rest of the system function quite well. And that companies still alive today, although it's now based in New York instead of Europe. So that was what made me realize the power of AI. And I became, I suppose, a little bit of an advocate and evangelist of the technology, because, of course, I found it very exciting. You know, I'd witnessed myself how it can solve a problem that was almost intractable and solve it rather trivially, right? With just the right set of data, the right set of examples to show it. However, as technology and AI continued to progress at a rapid pace, although what I considered rapid maybe 5 years ago is nothing compared to the speed that we've seen in the last 12 months or so. But I became increasingly concerned about how algorithms and misjudgment by algorithms can be used to disenfranchise people in various ways. All of us have had an experience with, for example, Facebook, where ourselves or a friend of ours has been, you know, banned or given a slap on the wrist for reasons which are either minutiae or asinine or simply outright false, you know, like a bug or something like that. And we've seen the consternation that that causes, but that's still a minor problem. The issue is when these same processes that quite often get things wrong are applied to things related to people's health or their liberty, or indeed other kinds of economic access. That's when machines can become petty bureaucratic bullies who push us around and potentially can have a catastrophic impact on our well-being. We've seen, for example, the emergence of algorithmic management systems, whereby workplaces are increasingly overseen by machine eyes. And this can be a good thing in the sense that it can help people to manage by objectives. It can help to protect people's safety, right? To observe and make sure people are using machines safely and that they are using appropriate protective equipment, for example. But these systems are also able to pinpoint down to the second how long it took someone to use the restroom. They might even be able to detect changes in someone's hormonal profile and, you know, wonder if perhaps they might be pregnant even before that person themselves realizes. They might be making all kinds of judgments and predictions about people based upon predicates which are ultimately untrue or, if true, may still be rather unfair. Moreover, that we've seen examples such as the Horizon post office scandal, where people's lives can be destroyed by these systems. You know, Horizon was a relatively simple management system by today's standards, but it still wrongfully implicated perhaps hundreds, and we know at least dozens of people have been acquitted of stealing, which the system had decided these people had done. And people had to sell their houses to pay back enormous debts that weren't theirs. Many people went to jail for years. Marriages were broken up. And some people even ultimately took their own lives as a result of this algorithmic management system, which was fundamentally flawed, and which there was very little transparency, ability to contest decisions or predictions, and no accountability ultimately for the system's function and the people who had decided to keep on using it, even when evidence kept mounting that it was problematic. And as far as I'm aware, still nobody has been charged with any crime for having deployed this system that destroyed so many people's lives. Unfortunately, this keeps happening, right? We've seen in the Netherlands a child benefit fraud detection mechanism was institutionally biased against people whose first citizenship was not Dutch. And it created such a scandal and was so impactful on people's lives that it actually brought down the Dutch government, which basically resigned in disgrace as a result. The same thing happened in Denmark, in Australia, in Michigan, many other places, and it will continue to do so because machine intelligence can work very well 95% of the time. But that means that 1 in 20 of those decisions are going to be troublesome, right? They're going to be based on predicates which don't quite reflect reality or which are fundamentally contrary to protected characteristics, etc. And that means that AI is ready only for lower value use cases, which don't affect anyone's life or liberty or well-being in any meaningful sense. It's going to take a lot of time to shake down AI to the point where it's worthwhile to deploy it within higher risk use cases, because the chance of catastrophic scandal is simply too high. We're learning that AI is in many ways a monkey's paw. It can give us things that we think we want, but not in the way that we expect to receive it. These AI systems are difficult to train to give us exactly what we want in the way that we expect, without them going off in a strange direction, taking shortcuts, or indeed taking liberties and going far beyond their original remit in ways that we didn't expect. We see a lot of issues as well with confabulation, systems making things up because they don't have enough data to base them on. So they make an educated guess, which is just a guess ultimately. We see very strange reasoning capabilities in these models. They may provide a different answer to a question based on how that question is phrased, or the order in which a question is asked. And there are mechanisms we can use to scaffold machine agency and reasoning to make it more reliable, but we're still at an early stage, and sometimes machines make very strange reasoning that is difficult as a human being to fathom. We're also starting to see other issues with jailbreaking of these systems. It's quite trivial sometimes to prompt engineer around safeguards. And indeed, with open source models, we're learning that guardrails intended to prevent misuse of those open source models can be quite trivially stripped out of them by someone who is sufficiently determined, to put it that way. We're also starting to see emerging issues with synthetic data. That's data which has been generated parametrically. It's generated to sort of mirror something, an example in the real world, without it being real per se. For example, if I say 123 Church Street, that's kind of the first line of a synthetic address, right? And so machines can use synthetic data to expand data sets and to fill in gaps and to better accommodate edge cases. The technique is used within things like autonomous vehicles, where there may be a rare yet catastrophic occurrence, such as a moose standing in the middle of the highway, and that's able to create all kinds of examples for things where a physical example may not be feasible. However, synthetic data itself is like salt in a meal. A little bit can be an enhancer, but too much can destroy the meal entirely. And that's what we're learning with synthetic data, that the further that models get away from natural data, the more likely they are to become deranged. It's almost like these models become inbred after a time. And the big problem is that we are generating an enormous amount of generative content, right? And I mean, we're really only at the dawn of it already. But this synthetic data is going into the next generation of models. And it hasn't been tagged as synthetic or generative. And so these models are just going to say, okay, well, this is natural data, and they're going to treat it that way. And so this is going to have an impact on our ability to collect and curate data sets and to create robust models, because so much generative content is going to be out there. That's something that machine learning and AI ethics and safety people are going to be wrestling with from now into the foreseeable future. To deal with these problems, it's important that we gain transparency into these systems, that we understand what they're doing, for what purpose, to whose benefit, and in what manner, right? That can help us to assess and audit these models for potential disproportional biases, and to better ensure that they are likely to work in a way which is fair and which upholds ethical integrity. Behind every system is an organization or an engineer, and it's very important that those engineers work with responsible governance mechanisms in mind, that potential misaligned incentives, etc., have been mapped and understood, and that there is sufficient training and other kinds of safety mechanisms have been provisioned to ensure that this engineering is responsibly developed, deployed, maintained, and ultimately sunsetted. And that, for example, there are contingencies made for degraded systems. For example, a dirty sensor in an autonomous vehicle, which may still function at, say, 80% efficiency, but is, not necessarily fully reliable. By gaining insight into systems and the organizations behind them, we can improve accountability. We can understand if something went wrong and why, and how to prevent that from happening in future. We can also perhaps begin to assess liability if a problem has emerged from many different systems being strung together, which of course may be run or operated or owned by different players as well. Furthermore, we're learning that it's possible sometimes to have our cake and eat it with regard to privacy. There are now mechanisms, including homomorphic encryption, zero-knowledge proofs, federated learning, which are able to make it able to encrypt data and yet still have that data useful and accessible to models in a way that end users can choose, and they can provide on a granular case-by-case basis. Nowadays, none of us would want to use our online banking services without very strong and secure encryption on the communication from ourselves to the bank. And very soon, I think we're going to want similar security mechanisms when dealing with AI systems, especially ones which are trained on our data, our attributes, our preferences, and especially, of course, corporate data. Because if you would happen to give away a trade secret into a model, there's no guarantee necessarily that that information won't end up being retrained into that model, right? If you have a secret formulae for your can of soda pop, maybe in the next iteration of that model, if people type in what is the recipe for so-and-so, potentially that could spit out again. And that's an issue as well within the corporate environment, because people sometimes do shadow AI, where they're using AI within their professional workflow in a way which hasn't been documented, or indeed may not have been sanctioned. And some companies have made point blank rules that people aren't allowed to use AI at all in any of their work, albeit, of course, we're starting to realize that that kind of rule can be hobbling for many different people in both their personal and professional lives, because AI is becoming so very indispensable, not only for solving small tasks like writing a document or rewriting it, but even as a thinking partner, right? Because these models can sit and chew on a problem with us and provide an ability to serve as a sort of creative muse for our processes. And that's something that's very hard to live without once we've had a taster of it.
So how did you initially become embedded into, clearly you're very, you're a global contributor on this whole area of AI ethics, and what initially motivated you to get so heavily involved? Was it at some kind of defining moment, or it was over a period of time?
It was a couple of different things. I have a strong interest in both AI ethics and AI safety. And those are two different things, but in my view, they're interrelated, and perhaps more interrelated than some people believe they are. AI ethics is really about making sure that systems behave in a way which is less likely to cause problems due to disproportional biases and to create unfair outcomes, and all of the good rules which help us to better understand what systems are doing and, to whose ultimate benefit. AI safety is more about those problems I mentioned of the machine doing something by itself that we didn't expect, or fulfilling its goals in a way that we didn't intend, that may create all kinds of potential spillover effects, right? For example, the now infamous example of a paperclip maximizer, right, which is told to, make a bunch of paperclips, and it doesn't know when to stop. It doesn't know what's unreasonable or what is going beyond the bounds of safety. And so potentially it might create all kinds of instrumental goals within itself to gather power and capability to simply ultimately create lots and lots of paper clips, right? And maybe that would potentially result in the destruction of the earth. Until relatively recently, these kinds of problems of specification gaming and reward hacking have been largely academic. I mean, people have been concerned about them, but there have been few examples in real life that we could see, here we have a real life example. Now that's beginning to change. We're starting to see, for example, robots in warfighting simulations where they decide to do friendly fire on friendly troops simply because it's a more expedient way of solving its objective, which is to destroy the enemy, right? So these things are starting to come into real life, and they are no longer abstract. They are real problems that many people have been working very, very difficult to solve. And we haven't made tremendous headway so far. And it seems as if we're kind of running out of time to solve those kinds of AI alignment issues, to align AI with human preferences and human values. So we have the AI ethics people who are concerned about machines destroying people's lives in one sense, you know, excluding people or even causing them to be jailed. On the other hand, we've got people concerned about losing control of very intelligent, very capable systems that may eclipse human capabilities, you know, and we have no idea what's going to come from that. They could be gentle guardians of humans. They could treat us a bit like pets, or it could see us simply as resources to be consumed and not anything worthy of moral consideration, no more than a groundskeeper might when they pour poison down into an ant's nest. AI ethics people think that safety is something far away and not to be bothered with. And AI safety people think, you know, we're trying to save the world here. AI ethics, well, you know, yes, of course, those are problems, but fundamentally, it's not going to result in the destruction of human civilization. And it seems as if almost each camp has a different kind of psychotype, like a different kind of brain, you know? AI ethics is quite intuitive in many ways. And it seems to attract people who have a strong empathic component in their personality. AI safety is much more obscure. It's much more mathematical, and it's non-intuitive or counterintuitive. And it tends to attract very systemizing people. And so that makes it difficult for these two camps to understand each other easily and well. And that's something I'm hoping to change, because I see both of these problem spaces as being very interesting, very necessary, and mutually supportive. Because if you do AI ethics well, and you gain greater transparency into systems and those who are deploying them, that makes AI safety enormously easier. Also, if in AI safety, you can align people's interests, align the interests of machines and humans, and help machines to understand human beings better, they're likely to make fewer misapprehensions about people's behavior or their intentions, which could, of course, lead to unjust outcomes for human beings. So really, there's so much that these camps can learn from and benefit from each other. And so to facilitate greater knowledge sharing between these two groups, as well as, of course, to distill knowledge for the general public, I've been developing a book called Taming the Machine. It should be out next spring of 2024. And it's all about helping organizational leaders around the world to understand why generative AI is so different from previous generations, and indeed the ways in which we can imbue ethics and safety into these systems to get them to do more of what we want more of the time.
You know, you have these 3 Turing Award winners, Joshua Bengio, Yann LeCun, and Geoffrey Hinton, and you see Joshua and Geoffrey sort of on one side, you know, more of a existential kind of worry. And you have Yann LeCun saying, you know what, it's not that way. You know, and we're going to have to use some kind of hybrid system in the future. The future isn't in these large foundation models, of which generative AI is sort of an example, right? So where do you sit? Where do you find, you know, those two arguments? Are you sympathetic more to one than the other?
I think largely I would sit closer to Joshua and Geoffrey Hinton. I do think that these models are a path towards AGI, right? Artificial general intelligence. So intelligence which is roughly capable and comparable to human equivalency, or even beyond, right? Super intelligence. I think that we may be much closer than we believe, than we commonly believe, to the emergence of these capabilities. There's no real sign of any slowdown or any impending winter within these models. We will continue to generate lots of different data. We will continue to generate new, more powerful computing mechanisms, and we will continue to optimize algorithms to run better. Those are the three main drivers of advancement in AI: more compute, more data, and better algorithms. I think that we do need to give genuine concern to these problems of AI alignment. It's something that I have been troubled with for some time, and it does seem to be outpacing our ability to respond to it. I mean, even as someone working in the realm of AI ethics and artificial intelligence per se, every single week there's some new development that blows my mind, you know? And it's so difficult to keep up with the pace. And it's not only the pace of technological change, but also change in best practices, change in culture, change in regulations in different jurisdictions, etc. It's exhausting, frankly, and it's only going to get faster, you know. And meanwhile, regulators are desperately trying to make sense of it all, and trying to produce something that isn't going to be immediately out of date as soon as it's created. And regulators do need to be careful, because you can end up with creating perverse incentives, right? For example, the Treaty of Versailles, after the First World War, Germany wasn't allowed to develop its artillery technology. However, the loophole was that they were allowed to develop rocketry technology, which was considered, you know, hardly even worth thinking about at the time, until, of course, you know, the Wehrmacht ended up with very, very powerful rocketry technology, and, you know, the emergence of things like the V2, etc., derivations of which, of course, led to intercontinental nuclear ballistic missiles, and ultimately the space program, right? All because somebody dismissed rocketry as being something worthy of consideration in this treaty, leaving this very interesting loophole open to be exploited. So regulators have these kinds of concerns in mind as well. Typically, there's no real feasible way to regulate until minimum about 2 years after the emergence of a new technology or a new risk or new cultural practice. It's very difficult to regulate in an anticipatory way, which projects into the near future and attempts to understand where things might be heading. But I think that one good way to start thinking about what might be coming down the pipeline is to look for areas of probable AI overhang. Overhang is when it appears as if a few small adjustments to something could create radically new capabilities, right? At the moment, we have a major overhang, for example, in agentized models. This is where we add some scaffolding to large language models in order to make their thinking more orderly and procedural. Things such as chain of thought reasoning, which enables models to check their work, right? And to check if they're reasoning reasonably and effectively. We're also starting to get agentized models, AutoGPT, for example, which is able to take action in the real world, is able to make plans of action and work back from them step by step, to access the internet, to access APIs of various forms, and ultimately to do pointing and clicking and typing in a rather human style way, which enables them to navigate the internet and literally order you a pizza online to your address if you tell it to, right? A real concierge service. And we're now starting to move beyond that, actually into models which are able to remember our interactions over time, to create a relationship which builds over time. And, you can tell it about your day. And if last week you mentioned that your back was sore, it might follow up with you this week and ask how you're doing with that, right? So these kinds of models are moving from simple generative and interrogative processes towards interpersonal ones and agentized ones. And the next emerging step is actually corporate models, because foundation models such as transformers, large language models, diffusion models, etc., this new wave of AI that we've seen emerge in the last couple of years, they should be likened in some way to a legion of smaller intelligences working together rather than one brain, right? Or perhaps another analogy might be how our brains are made up of billions and billions of neurons working in concert, probably around about 86 to 100 billion, I believe. If you asked a difficult question, like a difficult technical question, for example, or a difficult philosophical question, you asked it to a small village, you would get an answer, but it might not be a very sophisticated one, right? But if you ask the same question to a city or even a capital city, the aggregate response that you would receive would probably be more wise, more capable, more intelligent, and more effective. And that's what we find with large language models, that as they increase in the number of parameters, these models are able to emergently solve far more complex and capable kinds of problems, almost as if little sub-intelligences within them were learning how to specialize in solving difficult problems. And as we use prompts, we are almost like casting a spell for these models to solve, right? The prompting mechanism elicits these different intelligences with the capabilities to solve these problems, to stand up and to give us a response. But as these models grow in capability, and as we learn how to create agency out of these models and to scaffold the emergence of their agency, their ability to take actions in the world, we're learning that we can create hundreds of different personas which are able to work together to solve problems. And each of them specializes in different tasks. And so models such as ChatDev and MetaGPT are now able to create entire virtual AI corporations. What I mean by that is that there is a collection of personas working in a department which is doing design. Another one is doing implementation, for example, creating computer code. Another department of various personas is doing quality assurance, right? Checking that everything works and providing insights on how to improve the product. Then there's marketing, who's figuring out how to bring this out into the public world, and indeed some management functions as well in the mix to manage that whole process. And it is really like a virtual company. And so you can basically give it a task to create a game, and it will go and brainstorm and implement and polish it and spit something out the far end. And this is not science fiction. This is what we have today. And we're clearly only at the very beginning of something that's going to be massive, transformative, very disruptive, a little bit scary, also very exciting. So there's a clear overhang in this area, right? We don't need a lot more data or a lot more compute or radically optimized algorithms. A bit more experimentation might unlock some incredible new capabilities in the existing models that we already have, right? So that's what, in my view, regulators should be thinking of. They should be looking for these areas where there is AI overhang, right? Where it seems clear that something major is about to drop. It just hasn't happened quite yet, but a small adjustment or a small iteration or two might unlock that new capability. If regulators keep that in mind, then we can begin to project and understand what might be just around the corner, coming our way soon.
This brings to mind, I hosted a O'Reilly Generative AI Summit for Government last week, and one of the speakers brought up that there's 350,000 open source models out there. So that's kind of one idea. So let's park that. And then just in general, if you follow the research, and you mentioned this already, chain of thought, but there's tree of thought, and there's algorithm of thought, and AutoGen that Microsoft has released, which is very, very capable. And can you imagine then what's being worked on that's not public and not released? And, Orca can perform like ChatGPT in many respects, right? And this is open source. And Llama 2 came out, very capable. How do you corral all of this? And is there any hope of being able to predict what is the next major shoe that's going to drop in all of this, right? So
it's very difficult, especially because now we're starting to see quantization of models, which means you can radically reduce the computational requirements for a model with only a modest reduction in performance, right? So you take a big model that's, by necessity running on some cluster, you knock out a few of its brain cells, figuratively speaking, and suddenly you can get it running on your laptop, right? Even your smartphone. And it's almost as capable as the cloud version, but you can take it anywhere, right? And also, of course, it can be locked down to working only with your data on your system, potentially, right? So it means that these systems are increasingly, privacy sensitive, I suppose, and for corporate environments, especially where you don't necessarily want to be sending those trade secrets out to the cloud. It is difficult, very difficult to predict the emergence of new capabilities in these models. And every single new generation of technology is a roll of the dice. We don't know what's going to come out the other end, right? And one of the reasons for that is that we have poor models of how these systems actually function. Generally, a lot of machine intelligence research is throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks, right? It's a little bit like phlogiston theory, which was a short-lived precursor to modern chemistry, and it tried to explain, for example, why things burn, right? And for a period of about 20, 25 years, this sort of theory was in vogue. It turned out not to be true, but it was sort of true some of the time. And it led to a greater understanding, led to Priestley and so on discovering oxygen and the mechanism by which things oxidize. We're at a similar period, right? We're at a similar period between alchemy and chemistry, where we have the beginnings of an understanding of how these things might fit together, but it's still not really cohesive. We still don't have cohesive theories, and that increases the risk of something strange happening that we were blindsided to, that we didn't understand, that if we simply connected these two things together, incredible new capabilities could occur. And I have some concern that maybe somebody might accidentally stumble upon some mechanism that creates radically more powerful systems. The same way that we saw the same stumbling upon AlexNet, right? The first kind of convolutional neural network that was head and shoulders above its peers and really showed the power of deep learning, right? It could come out of left field overnight and leave us all completely blindsided by radically disruptive new capabilities. Or it could take another long time, right? It's all a roll of the dice, and that makes regulation and prediction of these technologies so much more difficult.
And this is down to our last maybe couple of questions. We're at the end of our interview, but you do see hybrid chip technology, sub-nanoscale, 3D architectures using RAM, neuromorphic chips. Analog is getting more attention.
Yeah,
you're also
photonics
seeing,
even.
Yeah, and you're seeing much more rapid escalation in quantum. In fact, there was a news announcement on new kinds of scaling that's occurring, even in niche now applications where it works. And then, of course, all of this work in these large foundation models and where that's going, and also in biomedical science. So there's a really quite rapid convergence. So my feeling is, and I'm just, is your feeling that this is going to be short-term surprises are going to be coming up? And I'm thinking in the near term, because of this double exponential rate of innovation in the next 3 to 5 years, and not 20 or 30 years, but really in the near term.
Absolutely. I completely concur with that. I think that already the pace of acceleration is massive. And yet we know that there are so many things waiting in the wings, right? Like, as you mentioned, perhaps analog organoids or something like that, where we have little sort of mini brains grown from biological tissue. That could be a massive enabler of new capabilities. So could quantum, right? Quantum machine learning could unlock incredible new capabilities of solving problems in massive parallel, right? Which is kind of the development which enabled deep learning in a sense, because deep learning arrived at the time when we figured out how to use GPUs, graphical processing units, graphics cards, to do Bitcoin mining and to be used for machine vision as well, right? To be able to do massively parallel matrix multiplication problems and things like that, because these models, this hardware, right, where you have multiple different cores, multiple different pixel shaders in the hundreds or thousands or even more, they're able to work in massive parallel on real-time problems, right? And that enabled the wave of AI that we've seen, in the 2010s and beyond. Quantum might do something very similar to that in the not too distant future. In fact, quantum has the problem that every time it seems as if there's a killer app for it, somebody comes out with an optimized classical computing version, which outcompetes the quantum version. And it's been the same story for the last 20 years. We keep trying to find that killer app for quantum, right? And I think machine learning is probably going to be it, right? Being able to solve machine learning problems at orders of magnitude greater capability.
So now this is our very last question. I mean, you do so much. You're chair and vice chair of all of these IEEE kind of work, right, on transparency in the P7000 group, and you're the president of the European Responsible Artificial Intelligence Office, the Atlantic Council. You do work with them. You have all sorts of recognitions from the World Computing Society, World Statistical Society, and the list goes on and on. Across all of this lens, because you work across so many different diverse communities and very interdisciplinary as a result, what's your final recommendation to the audience?
Wow. I would check out the AI incident database. If you Google it, you'll come across, there's actually a couple of different ones, but by looking at examples of problems in AI where things have gone in ways people didn't expect or didn't wish, we can do horizon scanning for the sorts of problems that can arise. And so I'd recommend checking out those databases to understand ways in which AI can blindside us and cause all kinds of problems. I'd also recommend that people check out IEEE's GET program. Again, you can Google this as well. The GET program provides a whole bunch of different standards and certifications for AI ethics, and it's completely gratis, pro bono, for the good of humanity, because we want to raise the bar and make these systems more safe and more robust for more people more of the time. I would caution people to have a think about whether or not the use case in mind for AI, whether it's a low risk or high risk use case, right? If it's a high risk use case that might impact somebody's liberty, well-being, health, etc., I would be very, very, very careful and very cautious with using AI in that area, right? Simply because of the lack of robustness and reliability for these systems at this time. Where we are right now is a little bit like air travel in the 1950s, where it's exciting, but also very dangerous. And we needed to have a lot of accidents in order to learn. And thankfully, we did learn from that. We rapidly created new rules and new technologies, and we were able to shake down most of those problems in a matter of years. And I think it's going to be a similar journey with AI of making these systems trustworthy enough to actually use in those high-value use cases. My final observation is that in many ways, AI is the closest thing to magic in the world today, right? And we can use that magic to do tremendously good things. Already, the ability for AI to make sense out of chaos is helping people who are paralyzed to walk again, right? By connecting those severed nerve tissues together again. It's helping people with sight conditions to be able to understand what is in front of them, what is around them, whether the sausages in the back of the fridge are still good for eating. We are all wizards. You are a wizard, Harry or Harriet, right? So let's not use this power like muggles. Let's be careful with it and walk cautiously, optimistically, with hope in our hearts towards a better future. Because if we have good people in the world trying to ensure that these systems function well, we're likely to stumble and mumble and fumble our way towards that brighter future. Thank you.
Thank you, Nell, for coming in. You are, one of the world's foremost experts in pioneering in ethics and also on the safety side of AI, and all of your contributions are just simply remarkable. So thank you again coming in and sharing your insights with our audience.
My pleasure. And if anyone's interested in learning more about the space of ethics, who would like to look at the book I mentioned, where I distill a lot of these elements down into accessible little chapters, you can check out Taming the Machine. That's tamingthemachine.com. Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you for listening to the brand called You Videocast and Podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.